Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of the history of racism by our own Forecast Radio. We're on chapter 15, Declaration of a Civil War, the Homestead Act. We'll be finishing our reading tonight, and hopefully, you enjoy. Slave owners in the South were desperate to keep up with the growing demand for cotton. Although the slave trade was banned in America in 1808, the last known slave ship, the Clotilda, landed in Mobile, Alabama in 1860. During the 1850s, so many slaves escaped to New Mexico from Texas they passed a law to limit the number of Black people in the territory. Enslaved people couldn't travel and were prohibited from testifying in court. Even slave owners' rights to arm slaves were restricted. In Virginia, an abolitionist named John Brown came up with a plan to arm every slave in the South. He planned to attack the biggest territory in the South at Harper's Ferry. Brown's first attempt to lead an uprising failed, but he had a second opportunity, likely because he was white, and Brown took full advantage. He led a group of 20 rebels, both black and white, and they took over the armory. Eventually, U.S. troops, led by Robert E. Lee, stormed the arsenal and killed many of the rebels, capturing Brown. Brown was charged with murder, treason, and inciting a rebellion. He was convicted and sentenced to be hung. Many people have heard the name John Brown, but few have heard of Shields Green. Shields went by the name Emperor and escaped slavery in South Carolina as a young man. When he arrived in New York, Frederick Douglass gave him a place to stay and introduced him to radical abolitionists. When Emperor met John Brown, he joined the raid on Harper's Ferry along with 5 other black men. Emperor survived the raid, but was arrested and charged with treason. They hung him a few days after John Brown. Frederick Douglass disagreed with John Brown's tactics and declined to take part, but he had to flee to Canada to avoid being charged with helping Brown. After Brown and his followers were executed, even more laws were passed to target the free black population. In Georgia, any free black person convicted of vagrancy could be sold into slavery. So it was illegal for them to be walking about on the street. Essentially, it was now illegal for black people to be poor or homeless, although laws made it difficult for them to make money. Additionally, Georgia outlawed the act of slave owners granting slaves freedom through their last will and testament. Within a year, Georgia completely banned slaves from possessing firearms for any reason. By 1860, the 8th census showed there were 3.9 million black people enslaved in America, but there were only 488,000 free blacks. Arizona passed the Expulsion Act of 1860 to banish free slaves from the territory. However, Maine, Vermont, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts granted some voting rights to free black men and allowed them to take part in elections. With more free blacks voting, Abraham Lincoln was elected the first Republican president, despite the tension between the North and the South. The South was making a fortune from cotton and tobacco, and the North wanted in on the profits. But many poor white Southerners were unable to afford owning slaves. They were already angry that slaves and free blacks were taking the jobs, and the North's plan to raise taxes sent many over the edge. To calm tensions, Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to North Carolina Congressman John Gilmer, reassuring him that he had no plans to end slavery in D.C. Lincoln also said he didn't intend to stop interstate slave trading, and even if he were to recommend it, Congress wouldn't listen. He felt the Confederacy's belief that slavery was justified opposed should be extended, opposed to the Union's belief that slavery was wrong and should be restricted, wasn't enough reason for them to be angry with each other. But the South was already preparing to secede from the Union once Lincoln was elected. In hopes of keeping the Union together, James Buchanan blamed the North for interfering with the institution of slavery in his State of the Union address. However, he said any one person being elected president isn't a just reason to dissolve the Union. Still, by the end of 1860, North Carolina voted 169-0 to secede from the Union. Many states, including Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Virginia, all followed suit. In response, Congress tried to pass amendments to protect the institution of slavery, but the states didn't ratify any. By 1861, the Civil War was officially on. Representatives from 7 states that already seceded from the Union met in Alabama, where they created and ratified the Confederate Constitution. Unlike the U.S. Constitution, they directly addressed the issue of slavery. One article declared no law could be passed denying someone the right to own enslaved people. Jefferson Davis, who was elected president of the Confederacy, said slavery was necessary to self-preservation in his inaugural speech. His vice president, Alexander Stephens, said his government rested upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, and slavery and subordination to the superior race is a natural and normal condition. Stephens also said their government was the first in the history of the world based upon that great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. As for the North, a Massachusetts senator and a general in the Union Army named Benjamin Butler declared runaway slaves to be contraband of war. Butler refused to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act since it simply didn't apply to foreign countries, which the Confederacy claimed to be. Abraham Lincoln, however, made it clear and repeatedly said his war was about taxes and not about slavery at all. Lincoln said, "I have no purpose directly or indirectly interfering with the institution of slavery in states where it exists. I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." Lincoln also said his policy was only to collect tax revenue before issuing the Morrill Tariff Act in 1861. The Morrill Tariff Act imposed a 40% federal tax on imports in slave states. Lincoln decided to make the first move by calling for 75,000 people to enlist in the Army for 3 months. Free blacks in the North demanded the right to serve in the Union Army as well, but they were turned away. However, Congress eventually passed the first Confiscation Act of 1861. The Confiscation Act declared all slaves in the Confederate territory occupied by the Union free, and they were no longer obligated to their enslaver. A Union general in Missouri named John Fremont confiscated Confederate property and said he'd free any slaves who took up arms against the Confederacy. Lincoln eventually overruled Fremont. He said freeing enslaved people would alarm his Southern friends and turn them against the Union. At the time, Kentucky declared itself neutral, but Lincoln feared he'd lose them to the Confederacy. But after the Union lost battle after battle, the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, accepted black people, free or enslaved. Lincoln eventually proposed a bill to compensate slave owners who released slaves in Delaware. However, the bill was never introduced, and slavery continued as usual in Delaware and in other northern states. By 1860, there were over 3,000 black slave owners on record. Most were able to buy their loved ones, but were still considered owners. There were only a few black enslavers who owned more than 65 slaves, including 6 in Louisiana. In New Orleans, a black woman named C. Richards owned 152 slaves. At one point, she operated a large sugar plantation with her son, P.C. Richards, and became the biggest slave owner in New Orleans at the time. Some black women even inherited slaves and other property from their enslavers. There were 5 or 6 African Americans who were major slave owners with their own plantations. In the 1820s, John Carruthers Stanley was the richest Negro in North Carolina. He owned 3 turpentine plantations and 163 slaves. John also had 2 white overseers, but used loyal slaves and spies to keep them in line. He was said to be a cruel owner, and his captives constantly ran away. Like his white counterparts, he had no problem selling children or separating families. He even held free blacks in bondage, although the same thing could have happened to him. When anyone tried to escape, he had no problem hunting them down. But most black enslavers owned their loved ones. Many cases were similar to Dilsey Pope's, who was born a free woman. Dilsey bought the rights to a man she loved so they could get married. She owned her land and her home and hired out her husband to work so they could make money. But one day, Dilsey and her husband got into an argument, and she sold him to a white neighbor out of spite. When she calmed down and went to apologize and buy him back, her white neighbor refused to sell him and kept him as their property. There was also Jacob Gaskin. Jacob was born free because his mother was free, but his father was still enslaved. When Jacob got older, he and his mother saved and eventually bought his father. But one day, Jacob was being scolded and disciplined by his father after misbehaving. Jacob became so angry, he sold him. He even bragged to others that he sent his dad to work on a Louisiana plantation to learn him some manners. In Kentucky, a Black woman named Aunt Fanny Kennedy bought her own freedom. She also bought several family members, including her husband Jim, who was often drunk. One day, Fanny was angry with her husband and sent him to his shop, and told him if he didn't get it together, she was going to sell him down the river. However, there were people like Nat Butler, a Black slave owner from Maryland. He convinced runaway slaves to run away and hide in his home while talking to their enslavers to find out how much they'd pay to get them back. Then he turned in the person he convinced to escape to collect the reward. If the reward wasn't enough, he'd sell them to other slave traders at a higher price. Nat became so notorious for his actions, he lost the trust of everyone, Black and white, and many tried to kill him. Then there were slavers like William Ellison in South Carolina. By 1860, William was the wealthiest African American and one of the biggest slave owners in the state. William's mother was a slave, and his father was her enslaver. This was often the experience for enslaved Black women in a rape culture that produced many children. And although William was mulatto, he accepted and adopted the mentality of his dad. Yet, he was still counted as a Black person on the census. Unlike the French, who used mixed race children as a buffer class, in most cases in America, whites disowned and enslaved their own children. Sometimes they even sold them. In America, anyone with a drop of Negro blood was seen as Black. Many biracial women and girls were sold alongside Black women and girls to be concubines, often referred to as fancy girls. They were seen as a status symbol for white males. The biggest markets for this were in New Orleans and Lexington, Kentucky. Teenage girls were considered to be the most valuable and just as expensive as the most prime field slave. They often paid over $1,500 for them, equivalent to $30,000 today. In Missouri, a 19-year-old enslaved biracial woman named Celia went on trial for killing her enslaver, Robert Newsom. Newsom bought Celia at the age of 14 to be a concubine. He raped her for over 5 years until she turned 19. He even had 2 children with her. When Celia turned 19, she fell in love with an enslaved man named George. After she was pregnant with her 3rd child, Celia wasn't sure if it was George's or Newsom's baby. Instead of stopping it himself, George threatened to break up with Celia if she kept allowing Newsom to rape her. Celia tried to ask Newsom's daughter for help, but she refused. So the next time Newsom attempted to have his way with her, she killed him in self-defense, then burned his body. Celia was arrested, but she argued it was self-defense at the trial. A Missouri law gave any woman taken against her will the right to defend herself, and even murder was justifiable. But the judge, William Hall, ruled against her. He said, since she was slave property, the law to protect women didn't apply to her. Celia was eventually found guilty and executed by hanging in 1855. A few years before Celia's case, another enslaved biracial woman, also named Celia, was the first woman executed on record in Florida in 1848. She was enslaved by her own father, Jacob Bryan. Bryan constantly abused and raped Celia like any other enslaved woman. Bryan was likely the father of her children and possibly her younger sister Anne's children as well. When Celia was 30, she killed Bryan by splitting his head open with a draw knife. She tried to flee but was arrested the next day. During her trial, she argued self defense because Bryan tried to discipline her while she was working in the field. Although a jury convicted her of manslaughter, they recommended executive clemency. However, the judge, Thomas Douglas, ignored the jury's recommendation and sentenced her to be hung. Citing a Florida state statute from an 1840 act, Douglas said, if any slave or free Negro or mulatto shall be guilty of manslaughter of any white person, they shall suffer death. Although Celia's execution was postponed, she was still lynched on September 22nd, 1848. In most cases, the biracial children of slave owners were made into field slaves or sold off. In other cases, they were made into house slaves and given more benefits than others, including being exempt from the same physical labor as field slaves. On even rarer occasions, they were accepted and claimed by their father, like in the case of William Ellison. Originally known as April Ellison, William became an apprentice to a cotton gin maker at the age of 10. He also learned other skills such as blacksmithing and even made enough money to buy his freedom. Most of his earnings went to his enslaver, but it became common practice for some in South Carolina and Louisiana to pay enslaved people for any work done on Sundays. After buying his freedom at the age of 26, he changed his name from April to William after his father and enslaver. He eventually started his own cotton gin business and owned 63 slaves, making him the largest mixed race slaver in South Carolina. As the Civil War broke out, William pledged allegiance to the Confederacy. He offered his slaves for their use and grew crops on his plantation to supply food instead of cotton. William's son even tried to join the Confederate Army, but was denied because he was still seen as a Negro. Despite being a former slave and viewed as black, William was said to be as harsh as any white slaver. While colorism still affects us worldwide today, at times, biracial people have a hard time identifying or being accepted by one side or the other. In William's case, he identified more with his father and enslaver, but today, William is used as an example of one of the few successful Black slave owners. In 1861, Harriet Ann Jacobs published her autobiography, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Harriet was born to two enslaved biracial parents in 1813. She was the first enslaved woman to write an autobiographical narrative on slavery, joining the likes of Frederick Douglass. Her story was one of the earliest to highlight the treatment and sexual abuse of Black and biracial women. She said, even a little child blessed with beauty, quickly learned that for a Black girl, it was a curse. Not only were they targeted more by white males, they also had to deal with jealousy from white women because they were often favored by their husbands. And judges repeatedly made it clear there was no such thing as rape when it came to Black women. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Harriet's enslaver, James Norcom, began sexually abusing her around the age of 12. He had already fathered 11 enslaved children and sold most of them. In some cases, like with Harriet, Black women tried to get white males to marry or fall in love with them, hoping it would lead to freedom. Norcom not only refused, but he became angry. He threatened to send her children to a brutal plantation where slaves were usually sent to be broken. To save them, Harriet was forced to leave them behind. She hid in a tiny crawl space in the attic of her grandmother's house for a year before she managed to escape to freedom in New York. Meanwhile, Texas seceded from the Union in 1861. They outlawed granting slaves freedom completely, even in a last will and testament. Florida reinforced laws to give an average white citizen on slave patrol more authorities to search the homes of free and enslaved Blacks at any time and to confiscate any weapons found. Yet, as Southern states continued to secede, Congress admitted Kansas into the Union as the 34th state and a free territory. West Virginia was admitted the next year as a free state, but since the territory was considered part of Virginia before, there were still enslaved people. But West Virginia's state constitution called for gradual emancipation. Also, as Utah also abolished slavery in 1862, Congress followed suit by abolishing slavery in Washington, D.C. The bill that was signed by Abraham Lincoln freed more than 3,000 people. However, the bill gave slave owners reparations by compensating them on an average of $300 for every enslaved person they lost. Lincoln approved another bill to prohibit Union soldiers from returning runaway slaves or captured slaves to anyone unless they were loyal to the Union. He asked the four northern border states to offer compensated emancipation, but they refused and rejected his plan. But America signed the Lyons-Seward Treaty of 1862 with Britain to suppress the slave trade aggressively. Although there was much undocumented, illegal slave trading, only one U.S. citizen named Nathaniel Gordon was found guilty and put to death. Lastly, Lincoln approved a bill to appoint representatives to establish relations with Haiti and Liberia. Those were the only Black nations recognized by the U.S. Lincoln's goal was to hurt the South, but he was clear it was about the war, not justice or freedom for Black people. Lincoln later said in a letter, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others, I would also do that." One Union general in South Carolina issued General Order Number 11 to free any captive in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida if they helped the Union fight. It would have freed over 900,000 people, but Lincoln overruled and nullified the order. He said no general or any person not authorized by the U.S. government could declare any slave in any state to be free. Congress offered compensated emancipation to slave owners in states loyal to the Union if they chose. Lincoln signed into law a resolution to prohibit slavery on all federal territories. But for white citizens, he passed an act that drastically changed the landscape of America. The Homestead Act of 1862 essentially gave 270 million acres, or 10% of the land in the U.S., away to citizens who remained loyal to the Union. Originally, the Homestead Act wasn't limited to just white males. It was also available for single women and free blacks. But to make a claim for 160 acres of free land, people had to pledge to not take up arms against the Union. The only other requirements to receive the land were you had to be 21, the head of household, and live on and upkeep the land for at least 5 years. Once you'd met the requirements and paid a total of $18, the land was yours. There was a $10 filing fee, a $2 commission, and after 5 years, another $6 fee before receiving a deed for the land signed by the president. Although technically the Homestead Act was originally supposed to be for everyone, Lincoln and many others still didn't recognize Black people as actual citizens or equals. He didn't want to appear desperate for help from Negroes. He turned down 3 Black regiments from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, despite all his efforts to recruit soldiers. But Lincoln was at a disadvantage because the Confederacy had far more resources. The South began winning more battles than Lincoln expected, like the Battle of Fredericksburg. Out of 70,000 soldiers, the Union lost over 12,600. At the Battle of Antietam, one of the bloodiest battles in American history, the Union started losing hope, and Lincoln had to rethink his strategy. Although he didn't see Black people as equals, he feared arming and training Black soldiers. He had no choice. Like with previous wars, accepting and arming Black soldiers was a last resort, but pride comes before the fall. So, like his predecessor, George Washington, he was forced to beg them to help him fight in exchange for freedom. Can you imagine a situation where you are given that much land? That is instantly life-changing wealth for a family. Given 160 acres for $18, even if that $18 at the time is worth $2,000 today, which is worth less than that. Isn't that amazing? That is just life-changing. And those types of wealth transfers happen constantly for white people in America, over and over and over again, where they were given land grants or given mortgages at a lower rate, or they were given opportunities to buy land. And Black people didn't have access to those same opportunities. Think about the VA housing land grants. Think about the land grants that and the land grant colleges and the farmer and the grants that they give to farmers. They do these things over and over and over again in history in an attempt to enrich and provide life-changing wealth management and wealth accumulation for white people. Chapter 16, An Emancipation Proclamation, the Draft Riots. With Abraham Lincoln taking over as president, it was now his turn to deal with the Negro question in America. Lincoln made it clear he felt Blacks shouldn't have social or political equity with whites. He believed colonization was the best answer. He said, with the differences between the races and the hostility of whites towards Blacks, it would be better to separate. In 1862, Lincoln hosted a delegation of free Blacks. It was the first time an American president met with representatives of the Black community in public to discuss racial issues. Lincoln's goal was to try to convince them to leave the U.S. and go to Central America or Liberia, but the Black delegation was angry. They argued that Black people were just as native to this country as whites and were entitled and deserved to enjoy the same rights. Although Lincoln didn't agree, the Union continued losing battles to the Confederacy. Eventually, he passed the Militia Act of 1862. The Militia Act finally allowed Blacks to join or work for the U.S. Army. It also offered freedom to any enslaved person in Confederate territory if they were able to escape and help the Union fight. Many Black leaders, including Harriet Tubman and Moses Dixon, organized Black troops and recruited more soldiers for the Union. Although the Confederacy forced Black women to work in hospitals, thousands voluntarily joined the Union as spies, nurses, and laundresses. Many others made it difficult for slave owners by running away or refusing to work. With newfound hope, with a newfound hope of freedom, even more captives escaped north to take up arms and fight. There were many Black heroes in the Civil War, although most went unrecognized. An enslaved man named Robert Smalls took over a Confederate ship and helped deliver it to the Union Army. Understanding he had no choice, Lincoln called for 300,000 volunteers, both Black and white, to join the militia for 9 months. Not long after that, and for the first time publicly, Lincoln announced his preliminary plan for his Emancipation Proclamation. Essentially, the proclamation was an executive order that declared all persons held as slaves in states rebelling against the Union shall be free from now on and forever. Of course, his proclamation didn't apply to states that were loyal to the Union. It didn't even apply to Confederate areas under Union control, with Lincoln hoping whites in those states would become loyal. Since it only applied to Confederate states that seceded and were no longer a part of America, his proclamation didn't free anyone. In response, Jefferson Davis signed an executive order of his own. His orders were to treat any Black soldiers captured as rebelling slaves and not as prisoners of war. The Confederate Congress also amended the draft exemption law. Slave owners and overseers on plantations with over 20 enslaved people were exempt from being drafted into the Confederate Army. Many slavers in the South moved to Texas with their captives to avoid the Union Army and their offer of freedom. The U.S. Attorney General issued a ruling that declared Freedmen born in the U.S. were considered citizens, but Lincoln was still against arming blacks or letting them fight in the war. Even though Black people weren't physically able to fight in the war, they used the opportunity to demand land of their own. The Freedmen's Association demanded Lincoln give free Blacks the seized land in the Sea Islands of South Carolina. They assessed tiny amounts of land to start working for themselves as a rehearsal for Reconstruction. In Mississippi, there was also the Davis Bend experiment, where free Blacks controlled their own community. After the Union seized Jefferson Davis's brother's plantation, Ulysses S. Grant told his officers to make it a Negro plantation. Former slaves worked together to farm the land and build their own community. They also made nice profits by selling cotton and other produce. While free Blacks attempted to build something of their own in Mississippi, one of the very first civil rights leaders, Ida B. Wells, was born enslaved there in 1862. Meanwhile, in Ohio, Mary Jane Patterson became the first Black woman to graduate college in America after graduating from Oberlin College. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln officially signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Since it only applied to Confederate states, he had no power to enforce it, and it freed no one. In fact, he said it wouldn't apply to any state that rejoined the Union, hoping to get them on his side. Southern newspapers like the Richmond Enquirer wrote, "This is the most startling political crime and stupidest political blunder yet known in American history. And Southern people can only choose between victory and death." Attempting to calm the outrage, Lincoln said that the states that were not included still have the rights and privileges they've always had, including slavery. Losses continued for Lincoln and the Union Army, yet he refused to arm Black soldiers. Eventually, he was forced to create the first federal draft. Around 162,535 males between the ages of 20 and 40 were drafted. Congress also passed a bill to allow 150,000 colored soldiers to enlist. In 1863, the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission was created to interview freed slaves in the South about the conditions they lived in. In a report from 1864, their findings included the racism Black soldiers faced in the Union Army. Despite Lincoln's proclamation, some Union soldiers illegally held runaway slaves until their enslaver came for them, even though they had agreed to fight against the Confederacy. Sometimes the soldiers forced the enslaver to pay money to get them back, or they sold them to someone else for a larger profit. The report also described the poverty and brutal conditions former enslaved people faced in the U.S. There were many cases of Union soldiers stealing from poverty-stricken Black soldiers. Frederick Douglass requested a private meeting with Lincoln for the first time to discuss the treatment of Black soldiers and Black people in America. Lincoln realized he had no choice but to arm Black soldiers to win the war, despite his fear of armed Negroes. The first all-Black regiment, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, was made up of the first armed Black soldiers who joined the war. The movie Glory was based on their story. As Robert E. Lee's troops continued to march north, it caused panic in Union territories. Lincoln had no choice but to turn to Black soldiers for help. Both of Frederick Douglass's sons joined the infantry. Harriet Tubman helped Union troops free over 700 slaves in South Carolina herself. Many took up arms and helped the Union fight. Despite the changing tide of the war, many white citizens were angry the Union armed and allowed Black soldiers to fight. Poor whites, mostly immigrants, were so upset it led to violent race wars in multiple cities lasting over a week. In Detroit, white immigrants, including many Irish immigrants, were already agitated about being drafted to fight in the war. They felt they were being forced to fight for the benefit of Black people in the South. After Lincoln's proclamation, the Detroit Free Press published multiple articles blaming Negroes for labor problems, citizenship issues, and the war itself. Newspapers constantly ran stories linking Blacks to crime and to having no morals at all. They especially ran stories telling whites to beware of the big bad Black man raping the helpless white woman. Many of these immigrants feared competing for jobs with Black people. They saw Black people as a threat to the working class white male. On March 6, 1863, after white mobs attacked Black residents, one newspaper reported it was the bloodiest day in Detroit. It started after a newspaper published a story about a Negro raping a young white girl. A biracial man named William Faulkner was accused of raping a 9-year-old girl named Mary Brown. Although William referred to himself as Spanish and Indian and didn't identify as Black, once he was accused, the paper immediately labeled him a Negro. As far as whites were concerned, he was nothing but a nigger who raped a white girl, whether it was true or not. Amid his trial, a lynch mob gathered at the courthouse. During the second day, they attacked random Black people in the area. Without any evidence besides the word of a 9-year-old girl, William was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. As he was transported to prison, a mob tried to take him so they could lynch him. The guard fired into the crowd in an attempt to stop them, but he killed someone in the mob. The group became even more furious that a white German was killed at the trial for a Black man. They attacked random Black people in their communities, targeting men, women, and children, and they destroyed businesses and homes. One man, named Joshua Boyd, was hit in the head with an axe as he tried to escape a building they had set on fire. The crowd looted businesses and homes and stole anything they thought was valuable. They also robbed any Black person they saw in the streets. By the end, countless people were killed and many more were injured. Over 200 homes and businesses were destroyed. Most Black residents left for Canada. William Faulkner survived the riot but went to prison. Years later, Mary Brown recanted her story and admitted that she had lied. Although she was never punished, William was released from prison and went on to start his own produce business in Detroit. As a result of the riot, Detroit established its own full-time police force, which remained all white until relatively recent times. Detroit wasn't the only place experiencing violent race riots as a result of Lincoln's draft. In New York, the draft riots of 1863 broke out around the same time. White immigrants, especially the Irish, were angry about being drafted and planned to take it out on the Black communities. The mayor, Fernando Wood, was so angry he suggested New York secede from the Union as well. White residents already refused to work alongside Black people, but by March, it escalated to physical attacks. When the official draft was held in July, over 1,200 people, mostly Irish immigrants, were drafted. As they gathered in bars to drink and complain about the draft, they decided to protest it. It wasn't long before they burned down the building the draft office was in, and soon they had destroyed other buildings. Since most of the troops were off to war, there were only about 800 guards left to stop them, but their numbers grew quickly to around 50,000. They targeted abolitionists or anyone classified as a nigger lover. In the beginning, the damage was limited to destroying and burning down businesses, but then they turned their attention toward Black people. White men, women, and children looted an orphanage for Black children before burning it down. They pillaged and destroyed many homes and businesses, including James McCune Smith's pharmacy, possibly the first black-owned pharmacy in America. The rowdy group walked the street looking for any Black person they could find. They beat and lynched a Black man before setting him on fire as he was coming from a bakery with only a loaf of bread in his hands. The mob blamed Black people for all of their problems, and their goal was to drive them out, even if they had to commit genocide to do it. 120 people were reported killed, but some estimate that thousands of people may have been murdered during the riot. Thousands more left the city, and the Black population fell to under 11,000 for the first time since 1820. The draft riots continued to spread from Boston to Ohio, although not as violent as the riot in New York. The rioting in Ohio was already occurring in 1862. It started after two Black men got into a heated argument with a group of white guys. They accused one of the Black men of striking a white man in the head with a block of wood. The group quickly turned into a mob, and they attacked every Black person in the area. Some Black men fought back and wounded some members of the group. As time passed, white citizens continued to attack Black people randomly, ambushing them as they walked down the street. Their goal was to intimidate Black residents into leaving the state so they wouldn't have to compete with them. They complained that Negroes were interfering with their labor strikes. But unlike German immigrants who were scared away, Black people were still willing to work, so they felt a need to resort to violence. The anger from northern and southern states grew as the war dragged on. After 2 years, the number of casualties was adding up. Between the Emancipation Proclamation, the draft, and the arming of Black soldiers, things were reaching a boiling point. But this bloody war seemed to have no end in sight until the Battle of Gettysburg. The battle lasted 3 days, and it was one of the bloodiest battles in American history. Over 10,000 people died, and more than 40,000 were wounded. As soon as Lincoln began accepting Black troops, the tide of the war immediately turned. Robert E. Lee's troops were pushed back, and he realized how much Black troops strengthened the Union Army. In response, the Confederate government threatened to capture Black soldiers and put them back into slavery or execute them. Since many Black soldiers escaped to help the Union fight, Lincoln declared the government would give the same protection to any soldier, no matter the race. For every Black soldier sold into slavery, a rebel soldier was to be put into hard labor. For every Black soldier killed, a rebel soldier was to be put to death. Lincoln even wrote a letter to Ulysses S. Grant saying, "Colored troops are a resource which, if vigorously applied now, will soon close the contest." But he wasn't the only one who recognized the difference Black troops were making. The Alabama state legislature authorized using enslaved Blacks in the Confederate Army, although the last thing they wanted to do was arm them. When Confederate soldiers attacked Lawrence, Kansas, they killed 150 civilians and caused over $500,000 in damage. Lincoln met with people like Frederick Douglass and the governor of Maryland to discuss recruiting more Black soldiers. With Lincoln still calling for 300,000 people to enlist, he was invited to give a speech in Gettysburg, otherwise known as the Gettysburg Address. The Federal War Department also established the Bureau of Colored Troops for Black soldiers. Hoping to end the war, Lincoln issued a proclamation of amnesty and reconstruction. He offered a pardon to anyone who participated in this treasonous rebellion if they became loyal to the Union. Although it didn't end the war, he also issued another proclamation declaring the last Thursday in November to be a day of Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, overseas, Lincoln made a treaty with Liberia to establish trading. In the Netherlands, the Dutch finally abolished slavery in all of its colonies in 1863. In Africa, the French tried to expand to the west in areas near Senegal. In 1859, France attacked the Tupelor Empire until they were forced to give up much of their land and relocate to modern-day Mali. Al-Hajj Umar, who established the empire, fought back against the French and even took control of Timbuktu. However, he was killed in 1863. After his army was defeated by the Tuaregs, the Moors, and the Fulani. Back in America, by 1864, 400,000 enslaved people escaped after making it behind Union Army lines, and many signed up to join the fight. Lincoln proposed a plan for slave owners to free their captives in exchange for fighting. He even asked them to hire their former slaves for fair pay and treat them the same as white workers. But Lincoln still called for another 500 people to enlist, including Black people. He asked for volunteers to serve in the Army for 3 years or until the war ended. Congress even approved an act to compensate slave owners in border states who remained loyal to the Union if their slaves were drafted. But a senator from Missouri named John B. Henderson was the first to propose the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. After Lincoln was nominated for his second term as president, he called for another draft to recruit 200,000 more soldiers into his army. Following a meeting with Ulysses S. Grant, Lincoln gave him full control of the U.S. Army. When Louisiana's state constitution abolished slavery in 1864, Lincoln wrote a letter congratulating the governor on being the first to govern Louisiana as a free state. As the Union gained control of the war, Arkansas and Tennessee also adopted new constitutions to abolish slavery under Lincoln's 10% plan for Reconstruction. This plan offered forgiveness to Confederate states and allowed them to be readmitted into the Union after at least 10% of voters pledged allegiance to the Union. Voters were also allowed to elect delegates to establish new state constitutions and governments. All Southerners involved in the rebellion, except high-ranking Confederate officials and soldiers, were granted a full pardon. All their property, except slaves, were returned. The U.S. Senate passed the 13th Amendment with a vote of 38-6. The 13th Amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Of course, this didn't actually end slavery, as movies like the 13th demonstrate. However, few mention the part about involuntary servitude and what that really means. As Black people, we would soon find out. They were still dealing with slavery, just under a different name. A few days after the 13th Amendment passed, a Confederate general called for the massacre of colored troops in Tennessee. They slaughtered 262 Black soldiers, although most of them tried to surrender. Black soldiers didn't get the same protection or pay they were entitled to. Lincoln passed the Equalization Bill to ensure they received the same pay as white soldiers. They were entitled to partial back pay, but that didn't go into effect until 1865. Congress also voted on a resolution to abolish slavery completely, but it failed with a vote of 95-66. When Lincoln formally accepted the nomination for president at the Maryland Constitutional Convention, slavery in the territory was finally abolished with a vote of 30,174 to 29,799, with a difference of 375 votes. Lincoln eventually signed an act to repeal the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850, along with other laws referring to runaway slaves. After Congress passed the Wade Davis Reconstruction Bill, of 50% of the white male population was required to take a loyalty oath before they were readmitted to the Union. The bill also outlawed slavery and gave Black people the right to vote. However, high-ranking Confederate officials still weren't allowed to vote. Lincoln opposed the bill because he feared Confederate rebels wouldn't accept it. The Wade Davis bill also gave Congress control over Reconstruction instead of the president. The fighting continued, and Lincoln was still calling for 500,000 soldiers to volunteer. In response, Jefferson Davis recommended the Confederate government buy slaves to fight with them. Davis also promised to free them at the end of the war. Lincoln continued to meet with Frederick Douglass to recruit more Black soldiers. He also met with Sojourner Truth to discuss ways to announce the 13th Amendment. Not only did Lincoln want to end the war, he also wanted the Black people to vote, ensure he'd get reelected. He also wanted the Black vote to ensure he'd get reelected. Eventually, Lincoln was reelected president. Congress also admitted Nevada into the Union as the 36th state in 1864. Nebraska had the chance to be adopted into the Union that year, but failed to create a state constitution that complied with certain conditions. As the North took control of the war, General William Sherman's army marched through the South to capture and destroy Confederate territories. Over 17,000 slaves were freed by Sherman's army in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. About 8,000 former enslaved people helped him take the city of Savannah and freed nearly 7,000 more. General Sherman sent a telegraph to Lincoln saying the city of Savannah was a Christmas gift to him. After Louisiana abolished slavery, the New Orleans Tribune was established. It was one of the first Black newspapers to publish daily. In Boston, Rebecca Ann Crumple became the first Black woman to earn a medical degree and the first Black woman to become a doctor in America. As the Dominican Republic declared independence from Spain in 1865, the Union was on the brink of winning the war. The Confederacy debated if they should start arming Black people as well. The Confederate Congress became increasingly unhappy with Jefferson Davis and his administration. Once the Union armed Black soldiers, the Confederacy's hopes of winning the war quickly faded. Chapter 17, Juneteenth, 40 acres and a mule. Yes, we're going to finish. Greetings, KW Don 7. Thank you so much for tuning in. He says Urugu is doing the same thing in Belfast, North Ireland right now. Yes, they are playing both sides against the other and making the poor whites violent against the Blacks. They're doing the same thing now that they've always done. Although the U.S. Senate passed the 13th Amendment in 1864, it failed in the House of Representatives in a vote of 93 to 65. However, by 1865, Tennessee and Missouri adopted amendments to abolish slavery in their constitutions. As the North gained control of the war, General William Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15. The order called for 400,000 acres of land in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida to be confiscated and redistributed to the freemen who fought in the war. Special Field Order 15, later known as the Promise of 40 Acres and a Mule, was supposed to give newly freed enslaved people sole and exclusive management of their communities. No white person, except soldiers on duty, was allowed to live on the land. The order was issued after Sherman met with local leaders in the Black community who were still angry about the Ebenezer Creek massacre. Sherman's army marched through Georgia in what was known as Sherman's March to the Sea. As the Confederacy continued to be pushed back, many slavers abandoned their plantations, and thousands of slaves were freed. The Union Army used the newly freed slaves who were now able to work to clear the land and make it passable for troops and their equipment. They were often referred to as the pioneers. Those who were unable to work, mostly the women, children, and elderly, followed the troops for protection. They were referred to as contraband. The Union soldiers felt the contraband slowed them down and created too many problems. With Confederate troops led by Joseph Wheeler quickly approaching, Union troops led by Jefferson C. Davis reached Ebenezer Creek and were unable to cross. Davis ordered his troops to help the pioneers build a bridge as quickly as possible, and by midnight it was finished. Davis posted guards on the bridge and told the contraband to wait until all the troops and equipment were over the bridge before they came across. Once the troops and the pioneers were clear, Davis gave the order to dismantle the bridge. He told the guards not to let a single Negro cross. Davis left helpless women, children, and elderly in a death trap. Many panicked as Confederate troops closed in. Wheeler and his troops showed no mercy and slaughtered them. Several hundreds, if not thousands of people chose to jump in the icy water rather than face Confederate troops, even though many couldn't swim. Countless people drowned trying to make it across as Confederate soldiers fired their guns at them. Those who didn't jump in the water may have suffered an even worse fate. Chaos ensued as soon as Confederate troops arrived. Many were crushed in the initial stampede. The soldiers shot, slashed, and tortured women, children, and the elderly. One witness said, cries of anguish and despair. Men, women, children rushed by the hundreds into the turbid stream, and many were drowned before our eyes. From what we learned afterwards of those who remained on land, their fate at the hands of Wheeler's troops was scarcely to be preferred. Thousands of people were slaughtered, and some were returned to slavery. But Davis ordered his troops to keep marching. Some witnesses were infuriated with Davis's barbaric orders, which sparked a public outcry. In response, General Sherman and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, agreed to meet with 20 freedmen who represented the Black community. Sherman and Stanton asked them about emancipation and what it meant to them, about the war and what they wanted for the Black community. The group elected Garrison Frazier to be the spokesman. Sherman and Stanton guaranteed the freedmen protection and provisions until things were settled. Garrison said, "The best way we can take care of ourselves is to have land of our own. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own." When asked if they'd rather live scattered among the whites or in colonies of their own, Garrison replied, "I prefer to live by ourselves, for there is prejudice against us in the South that will take years to get over." 4 days after the meeting, Special Field Order 15 was issued. Within 6 months, 40,000 freedmen lived on 400,000 acres of coastal land. They worked for themselves, made the land productive, and quickly built their own communities. They established their own civil and educational institutions and even created a militia to protect them. To make it official, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, later known as the Freedmen's Bureau, was established by an act of Congress. The Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to help newly freed slaves adjust by providing food, shelter, clothing, and medical care. The Bureau was only set to last until the war ended and a year thereafter. Lincoln eventually signed a bill to free the wives and children of Black Union soldiers. In an attempt to stop the war, he proposed a resolution to pay reparations to slave owners in 16 states. The resolution offered over $100 million as compensation, but slave owners unanimously disapproved of it. How rich were they? Or how much money were they making that they could turn down $100 million collectively? On January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment was officially passed. Illinois became the first state to ratify it. Maryland, New York, West Virginia, Maine, and Kansas all followed suit, although Delaware refused. Even though the 13th Amendment was official, the war still wasn't over. However, General Sherman's army took Columbia, South Carolina, and forced Confederate soldiers to flee. The Union Army also took control of Wilmington, North Carolina. After the Confederacy suffered another major defeat in Waynesboro, Virginia, the Confederate Senate authorized using Black soldiers by a vote of 9-8. Although they were never officially enlisted, Jefferson Davis agreed and asked plantation owners to send captives to fight on their behalf. Still, Davis wrote a letter to Robert E. Lee saying his work with Negro troops hadn't made any progress and distrust was increasing, and it was embarrassing in many ways. As Wisconsin and Minnesota ratified the 13th Amendment, New Jersey and Kentucky still refused. The Union made its final campaign against the Confederacy in Petersburg and Richmond, Virginia. Davis was forced to abandon the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia. Rebel troops lost all hope and destroyed their own capital, worse than anything the Union Army did. They burned the city to the ground. After the Union took control of Richmond, Lincoln went on a tour of the city. Crowds of newly freed slaves praised him and called him the Great Messiah and Father Abraham. Although Lincoln, although Lincoln saw them as inferior, one man kneeled at his feet and blessed him. Another woman kissed his hand and said, "I know I am free, for I have seen the Father Abraham and felt him." After Lincoln was reelected, Black people, including Frederick Douglass, were able to attend the presidential inauguration for the first time. In his last speech, Lincoln supported limited voting rights for Black people in Southern states. But as General Sherman accepted the surrender of Confederate troops, Lincoln was shot and killed at the Ford Theater in Washington, D.C. by John Wilkes Booth. Nearly 2,000 Negroes demanded to be a part of Lincoln's funeral procession in New York. Not long after he was buried, Arkansas, Missouri, and Connecticut finally ratified the 13th Amendment. But after Andrew Johnson was sworn in as president, things quickly changed for the worse. Johnson immediately reversed Special Field Order number 15. He ordered the land to be returned to the former slave owners and offered amnesty and pardons to many Confederate soldiers for their treason. Johnson restored all their rights, except their right to own slaves. It wasn't until June 19th of 1865 that word of the Emancipation Proclamation reached Galveston, Texas. Nearly 200,000 slaves, some of whom were taken during the war, found out they were free from chattel slavery. Soon, South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, North Carolina, and Oregon all ratified the 13th Amendment. Yet Mississippi still refused to do so. Instead, Mississippi passed some of the first black codes and established a racial hierarchy to keep Negroes in their place. They didn't waste time criminalizing black people. They feared black people would spread out and make the white race disappear now that they are free. Mississippi passed vagrancy and peonage laws to criminalize black people for being poor. Negroes and mulattoes were required to show proof of employment or be arrested. A tax was levied only on the black population, and if they didn't pay, they were arrested. They also had to pay the cop that arrested them $5. Black people were allowed to rent property only in the city to prevent them from farming independently. It was also a crime for black couples to live together without being married. The state gave itself the power to take black children if they deemed the parents couldn't afford them. If the parents were arrested for vagrancy, their children were forced into apprenticeships, which is another form of slavery, most times with their former enslaver. Whites were even allowed to use capital punishment to discipline their apprentices as they saw fit. They were given the power to recapture anyone who tried to escape, similar to the fugitive slave law. It was still illegal for groups of black people to assemble at any time. It was even illegal for whites to associate with Negroes or mulattoes and treat them as equals. Other laws forbade black people from buying liquor or owning weapons. Anyone who broke the law was arrested and leased out to work for no pay. Well, they didn't receive the pay. The state or the entity that loaned them out received the pay. As soon as America passed the 13th Amendment, the black codes allowed slavery to continue through convict leasing. In Jackson, Mississippi, and other places like Norfolk, Virginia, black people held meetings to figure out how to move forward and demand equal rights. Finally, in December of 1865, the 13th Amendment was officially adopted into the Constitution. Although sharecropping would soon replace it, there are no words that could truly describe the horrors of chattel slavery and what they had experienced. Books written by former enslaved people, as well as some slave narratives, give some insight into their experiences. Also, movies such as Mandingo and Drum depict life as a slave to some degree. By 1860, the census showed there were close to 4 million people enslaved in America. They were estimated to be worth more than $3.5 billion, equivalent to $106 billion today. Slaves were by far the largest and most important asset in the U.S. economy. They were worth more than all manufacturing, railroads, and every other American asset combined. After the 13th Amendment became ratified, Oliver Howard was put in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau. The organization was created to help Black people with education, healthcare, and in the court system. Many thought slavery was over, but it simply took a new form. The key word in the 13th Amendment is accept, meaning there are conditions where slavery is still legal in America. Supposedly, the North won the war, but rarely in history has the losing side been able to fly their flag on federal buildings, honor their heroes, or control their own narrative. For decades after the war, statues of Confederate leaders were erected. To this day, there are still heated debates about if they should be taken down or not. Many former Confederate soldiers and slave owners came up with the expression, the South shall rise again. But the question is, how far did it actually fall? Another part of the 13th Amendment that isn't often talked about is the phrase involuntary servitude. Just by adding this phrase, it makes voluntary servitude legal. Although it affects everyone the same, by controlling the economic infrastructure in every way, you control what people are willing to work for and at what price. Add in a system of miseducation, and you have a recipe for things like the school to prison pipeline. Under Andrew Jackson's Reconstruction Plan, only whites could vote or hold public office. However, Congress refused to acknowledge any state governments formed under the plan. Still, Mississippi passed laws to forbid blacks from owning or carrying guns, ammunition, or bowie knives unless they were in the military. Louisiana also passed laws to forbid black people from owning guns unless they had permission from the police. Before the 13th Amendment was enforced, the first black codes were already in full effect. The radical Republicans like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, who had a black mistress and mixed race children, argued that former slaves needed more help from the government. They said, you can't release all of these slaves with no money, no food, no land, no animals, no weapons, or anything, and then say they are free. They also said, if you turn loose all these Negroes without giving them something, they will always be slaves. They suggested giving black people 40 acres and a mule along with $100 as a form of reparations. However, when Sumner and Stevens proposed legislation, Andrew Jackson vetoed it quickly. Andrew Johnson quickly vetoed it. Johnson said, Negroes are free and don't need any handouts. Let the niggers work or starve. Many white Southerners feared losing free labor and feared competing for jobs even more. South Carolina soon followed Mississippi's lead and forbid black people from owning guns or weapons. South Carolina also required Negroes to pay a bond for good behavior before they were allowed in the state. It was illegal for black people to make or sell liquor or any farm products. They weren't even allowed to sell what they grew without permission from a white employer. They claimed it was to keep them from stealing. In South Carolina, it was illegal for black people to have any occupation except as a farmer in a sharecropping contract unless they received a license from a judge. Licenses to work had to be renewed every year, and most likely they had to pay money to get it. Then, after heavily restricting black people's ability to earn money, The state harshly enforced vagrancy and peonage laws to incarcerate and enslave them. The law allowed the sheriff to arrest homeless Black people and hire them out as he saw fit. The law also forced children of anyone arrested into apprenticeships against their will. Often, they were forced to work for their former enslaver until the age of 21 for males and 18 for females. The law also gave white males the right to punish Black children for their behavior. If they tried to escape, white males could punish them however they chose. Plantation owners were obligated by law to feed, clothe, and send Black children to school. They were also required to teach them a trade. Not only was being homeless or unemployed against the law, loitering, gambling, peddling, or being a traveling salesman was also illegal. Black people weren't allowed to be on juries or to testify in court against a white person. Crimes like arson, rebellion, and burglary, even something as minor as stealing a pig out of hunger, resulted in the death penalty. Of course, being accused of assaulting a white person or looking at a white woman was punishable by death, even without evidence. Black people had a few more rights they didn't have during slavery, but they were heavily restricted. They could acquire land, own property, enter contracts, sue or be sued, and earn money. Marriage between Black men and Black women was also now recognized by the government. However, interracial marriage was still outlawed, especially between a Black man and a white woman. Of course, the right to vote was limited to white males only, but the Black codes applied to every person of color. South Carolina defined persons of color as anyone with more than 1/8 Negro blood. If you had more than one Black great grandparent, you were considered a person of color and the Black codes applied. Congress initially rejected the Black codes and accused the white Southerners of trying to reinstitute slavery. The Freedmen's Bureau argued that the Black codes were invalid. Under the guise of Reconstruction, the Bureau went to the South to provide food, welfare, and to help Black Southerners adjust to life after slavery. In reality, the Freedmen's Bureau was used to set up sharecropping contracts between Black Southerners and their former enslavers. Many Black people were unable to read and write and were tricked into signing away their freedom with these contracts. The American economy still depended upon cotton and tobacco produced by slave labor. So the Freedmen's Bureau, along with the government, threatened to withhold food and other resources meant to help Black people unless they signed the contract. Once signed, Black workers weren't allowed to quit, protest, or strike for better conditions or demand higher wages. Plantation owners were obligated to provide land, seeds, and animals. At the end of the year, workers were paid based on how much they produced. However, Black farmers were allowed to sell only what they produced to the white plantation owner. Although white planters could sell produce to anyone and make as much profit as possible, Black farmers were only paid what the white plantation owner decided to pay them. White planters also kept the books, so Black farmers didn't know how much money they were shorted. By the end of the year, Black farmers rarely made a profit. In fact, in most cases, they were in debt to the plantation owners. To pay it off, they had to work for free until they produced enough to cover their debt. Of course, they were never able to produce enough to get out of debt. Essentially, they were forced to work for free into perpetuity. And that is the crime of sharecropping, because you had this bureau, the Freedmen's Bureau was going around setting up these people to work as sharecroppers in this situation where they would only go deeper into debt. Continuing. If black farmers dared to protest or question their payment, the plantation owners had them arrested. Once they were considered criminals, they were forced to work for the same plantation owner for free. Since trying to run away was also a crime, anyone who was caught trying to escape was also forced to work for free. They had to work from sunup to sundown. Black sharecroppers faced the same punishments as they did during slavery and were subject to public floggings or whippings simply for disagreeing. If a plantation owner thought someone was planning a rebellion, they met it with violence. But now that they were no longer considered a white person's property, entire black families faced threats of being lynched daily. Countless men, women, and children were lynched in 1865 alone. In response, Republicans tried to use white Southerners' terrorism to help themselves politically. Their aim was to give black people the right to vote so they could use them to stay in office. Not even a year after the war, Confederate officials were already in the new government. Confederate politicians like Mayor John Monroe, Attorney General Andrew Harold, and Governor Albert Voorhees planned to help the South rise again. They deputized and armed hundreds of average white citizens to control the black population. In New Orleans, black residents planned a convention to discuss how to deal with the black codes. When nearly 130 black people marched toward the convention center holding the American flag, they were confronted by a mobbed arm, including deputized whites acting as police officers and firefighters. Once the group of black residents crossed over Canal Street, the mob became increasingly violent and threw bricks and bottles at them. After shots were fired, it quickly turned into a massacre. The group shot up the convention center, then set it on fire with people still inside. Black men, women, and children tried to get away, but they were attacked and shot at from behind. Some people tried to jump out of the windows to get out of the building and away from the shooting. White women even cut and stabbed people to death. They attacked every black person they came across. Many black residents were pulled off streetcars and beaten in the middle of the street before being shot. Remember, the only language they understand is violence. The official report said 50 people were killed and over 200 more were wounded. Other reports say over 200 black people were killed and another 86 were wounded during the massacre. The actual number of deaths is unknown. But eventually, martial law was declared. Not one white citizen was arrested or indicted for the attack. Now that chattel slavery was officially over, it became open season on black men, women, and children. Not only were whites upset that they had lost their free labor, they feared they'd have to compete for jobs. Many black people thought the 13th Amendment brought an end to their nightmare, only for them to be facing from a different form of terrorism. The New Orleans massacre of 1866 was one of the first attacks, but it certainly wouldn't be the last. Epilogue. Although slavery isn't the beginning of our story, it certainly was a major turning point. The concept of race itself had already existed, but Europeans were the first to use it as a measure of one's humanity. However, the system of white supremacy wasn't created overnight. It took centuries to cultivate. They had to strip us of our language, culture, religion, and family, and every concept of self identity. To maintain their system, it was important to eliminate any ideas of self autonomy, self respect, and most importantly, any ideas of freedom. I got tired of us not knowing our history. So it's important for us to learn for ourselves and our history and our story so that think tanks are created to ensure we never do. It became my mission to investigate anti Black talking points and find out the truth. So I went back to the beginning of what became the transatlantic slave trade and literally went year by year documenting our story from a Black perspective. Still, so much of our history was lost. It's important to learn our history no matter your age, and it's never too late. However, my intention of writing this was to compile our documented history into a book form and help the next generation continue to make progress in our advancement. In future works, we'll continue this journey, but just as they worked to create the system, we must work twice as hard to overcome and eliminate it. And just as they maintained this practice over centuries, it may take generations to heal. We may never get back some of the things that were lost, but it's important to relearn our worth and remember our value. Never let anyone else control your history because those who control your story can also control you. At the end of the day, we are all we got. We have to start standing for something or we'll keep falling for anything. And that is the end of the text. What do you all think? Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. That is the end of the text. I think that the author has done an excellent job of giving us tidbits and nuggets and a pathway forward to research our history and to know certain stories. And you should buy this book and highlight each and every story, each and every riot, each and every name, and use that as the guiding pathway to take you on the journey of understanding our history a little bit better. One of the things that we have to remember is that these people never change. They only understand violence as a language. That's why they get so upset when we begin to use their tactics against them. We have to get to the point where we are operating for ourselves and doing things for ourselves that move forward the the method and the lifestyle that we want to live. Greetings, forecast. How are you this evening?
Hey, what's going on, Mason? How you doing?
I'm doing good.
Well, no, I just hopped on real quick to say, I appreciate you reading this. Definitely, and I definitely can't wait for the next part. And the crazy part is, the next part it gets more violent if you can, it just turns into something crazier. So, yeah, like I definitely appreciate you reading this, but just going back through the history, you see how the process was made. Like it went from this to that, and then after slavery, like they just straight turned to pure violence, trying to kill us. So, but yeah, I just hopped on to say I appreciate you for doing this.
Well, I appreciate you for allowing me to do this. And you're right, they did. They looked at us, and there are documented statements where they looked at us as expired farm equipment. And that's because if they could not use us to exploit and extract our labor and our value for themselves, then we were no longer useful to them. And because we were no longer useful to them, then we had no use in their society. And as you have noted many times, they wanted America to be a white nationalist country. So this was supposed to be a white nation for white people, which meant, they wanted things like apartheid and slavery to continue on in this country in perpetuity. That's what they wrote in their wills. That's why they passed down slaves and whole families of enslaved people, right? For generations in perpetuity. That they wrote it down. That's what they wanted, and that was their intention. And when when white people began arguing with other white people about how much money they were making off of this slave trade and the profits that they were making from the cash crops that they were growing, that's when it became a problem. Like you said in the text, Abraham Lincoln wasn't trying to free the slaves because he was some benevolent person that saw slavery as wrong and a morally reprehensible act. He saw it as something that stood in the way of preserving the union of this nation, because he would not free one slave if it would preserve the union. He would free all the slaves. If he could free some and leave some, he would do that. He wanted to do whatever was necessary to preserve the social and economic standing of this nation called the United States of America, so that they would have a more firm footing on a global stage to barter with other countries for the other goods and services that they wanted and needed. So we have to get to the point where we are mature about that and we understand that. And it's interesting that you also noted how the enslaved people at the time saw him as some great liberator for the people, probably because of the propaganda that they were listening to from the Southern whites who felt Abraham Lincoln was threatening their way of life, but didn't really fully understand his methods and or methodology. And they resented him because he was not firmly on their side with, yes, slavery needs to be in place for all time and in perpetuity. Since he was not firmly on their side, in their mind's eye, he was against them because he wanted to tax them. You know, it's always about it's about the taxes, but it was about the fact that they didn't want to pay taxes on the profits that they were making through the slaves that they had. So they resented that.
No, facts, and that's why they always say that because the North didn't want to end slavery; they just wanted to get in on those profits. You know what I'm saying? They wanted a more of the more because they was already getting a piece of it, but they wanted more. Wanted them to pay more taxes just so they can build their infrastructure even more. And yeah, that's one thing that do stand out to me. Like, still, just when I think, like, just out the blue, that Abraham Lincoln was walking through Richmond, Virginia, and some black woman got on her hands and knees and was like, "Oh Lord, Moses is in the flesh," and kissing his hands, and he was looking at her like, "All right, Negro woman," you know. But
Mhm.
you know, and I then also look at how they transitioned it. They went to a smooth transition from like after the 13th Amendment to the prison population. That's when you start seeing the explosion of the chain gang. Although you could say slavery was the chain gang, you know, of course it was times 100, but that's when the chain gang and the prisons was filling up, you know, and all of that stuff started to happen because they never said who gets to make the law, who gets to enforce the law. But you know, we already know. So like, if you know they word their stuff very particularly is something that I noticed. But I mean, I don't even know why they even bother wasting their time wording it a certain way because they do what they do anyway. They're always gonna be Neanderthals. So, but anyway, yeah, I definitely those was definitely some parts that stood out to me though.
Absolutely. And it's amazing that we don't they keep us so busy working. I've said this many times. They keep us so busy working and worried about the day-to-day hustle that we don't have a chance to sit down and analyze what's actually going on with us and what they've actually done to us throughout history. They they keep us in a state of constant confusion and constant busyness, so we don't have a chance to sit back and analyze and say, wait a minute, this was really this, or this was really about that. We don't get an opportunity to decide that we want to collectively pay our thinkers. um they don't give us an opportunity to sit back and say we want to pay our thinkers so that our thinkers can think of a way that we not get back into this situation again over and over and over again. um and we don't have an opportunity because we're so caught up in the hustle and bustle of staying in this economy. We don't have an opportunity to sit back and say, wait, this is what they have done. Violence is the language that they understand. And this might be the method that we need to use in order to really liberate ourselves. And collective group economics really can work, but they keep telling us that it won't work for us because of the way that we have been socialized and the way that we have been indoctrinated to think that this is not going to work for us when it has worked for every other people group. Well, the only reason it won't work for us is because we live in an anti-black world. But if we created a pro-black buffer and then we were able to defend a pro-black buffer for ourselves, then we would be able to have and insulate ourselves in this environment so that we were able to do what was necessary for ourselves in this environment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But that just comes down to self-love. If we can trust each other or work together in the first place, whether it be to have resources, keep our resources together, because like I can at least appreciate people not spending their money with Asian communities and effort. It shouldn't take what it took to get to that point, you know what I'm saying? But I mean, at least something has happened, that we have put our collective effort, because that no matter what direction that you take it in, because you know how I feel, but let's just say keep it at the economic part, you know what I'm saying? Like, no matter what we do, if we do it together, we can't lose, you know what I'm saying? It's just a matter of us letting go of that weakness, or that you like to call, or that black people like to call love, and compassion, or whatever we like to call it. I think it's kind of cowardice, but you know there can only be one winner at the end of the day, you know what I'm saying? And it's up to you to provide and protect, and to give your children whatever privilege it is, even if it's the privilege to walk down the street without having to, or drive a car without being worried a cop get behind you and you got to keep looking in your mirror, or whatever the case may be, or to go to school and have a black man as a teacher who teaches you about the true history and world history of yourself, you know what I'm saying? Not just our history here in America, but our complete history as far as we can go back. So, but anyway, I don't want to keep you on too late, you know what I'm saying? Because I
Mhm.
definitely appreciate you doing this. So,
That's not a problem. We have an audience member in the chat, Nia Puat T5K, is saying some interesting things. They're saying they're a diaspora from South Sudan. 30 years later, this is all so mind boggling. The year is 2026. Science has proven white supremacy is a lie. Why doesn't lawlessness end? The proof is public knowledge. This is so evil. One of the reasons that white supremacy doesn't end is because it's an ideology put forth by white people that benefits white people, and they created laws to benefit themselves. And until we are in a position of power to create laws that benefit ourselves, not that benefit all humanity, but that benefit ourselves, and we're in a position to enforce them, then it's not going to stop. White supremacy it's an ideology continued by white people. Um, and They are not, they would you, if you were in a position of power, I'll ask you the Abraham Lincoln question. If you were in a position of power, would you write laws to disempower yourself and your people? And they're not willing to do that. And we have not yet decided to either leave in mass, economically organize in mass, or be violent in mass. The key is not to do all three. The key is to pick one strategy and stick to it. You know, in the book, it talks about how formerly enslaved people wanted to be in their own community with themselves because they understood that white people did not necessarily like them, and that being in community with white people, being spread out sparsely among white people, was not the best thing for them. And somewhere along the line, we missed that lesson, and we began to think, oh, it's good to be the only Black family in the neighborhood, when that is really the most dangerous position for you to be in, for you to be the first, for you to be the only, for you to be one of a few Black people in a community or in a neighborhood, because that's when you have a target on your back. They are watching you. There are several stories of Black families that were the first, or one of the first Black people in a neighborhood, and they and their friends and their church members got guns and stood watch, and they waited and watched and waited and watched and took shifts so that they could protect the property that this new Black family wanted to be in, because being in this white community was a step up. Well, that's because Black people couldn't get contractors into their communities. You have to understand why some Black people in the past wanted to move into white communities, because they couldn't get contractors to come do the work in their communities to improve them. And the skill set to improve the properties was leaving the Black community because they were too tired to work on their own houses. So, there are a lot of reasons why white supremacy goes on, but white supremacy goes on because it's an ideology put forth by white people that benefits white people. The United Nations created current day Israel state in 1948 to fulfill biblical prophecy of the chosen one Jew. Jews are made up. Yeah, Jews are made up. Um, there's a lot that we could say about the way that white people do their white peopling, the way that the Neanderthal mind works, how primitive it is, how they um how they were writing, like even in their scientific racism, when they were trying to say that the white skin is the most beautiful skin, when that isn't scientifically sound, because they can't withstand all climates like the Black skin can. There's just a lot that can be said about how primitive their mind works and how simple minded they are. But what they are sophisticated at is violence, and they will use violence at any stretch of the at any opportunity, at any stretch of the opportunity that they can, so that they are able to get the upper hand using violence. That's really all I have to say about that. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, yeah, I'll add this. Just as my last statement. Not only did they like it would take Black Wall Street for example, like they would destroy the community, and then when the Black people tried to rebuild it, they would make zoning laws so that you can't use such and such material here, to purposely not let them rebuild whatever they had built in the first place, and the only way that white supremacy so-called couldn't exist is by Black inferiority. So by definition, the moment we stop accepting the inferior role and doing what we have to do, then automatically it will be destroyed. You know what I'm saying? So but that's pretty much all I will say. And thank you again for like your time and for doing this and all of that stuff. And I definitely appreciate you. So, and shouts out to everybody else out there too.
Exactly. I want to thank this new person, Nia Puat T5 T5K, Sister Raw and the Elders, KW Don 7, and you Forecast for being here. I know that Anthony McPhail is listening. I know that Justin Liebert is listening. I know that Jacqueline L is listening. Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. Bawana Hagaziki is listening. Dorico Cooper is listening. And so many others are listening. And you, yes, you, dear listener, you are listening. I appreciate and value each and every one of you. I'm going to take 2 weeks off and then I'll be back because I haven't picked the book yet. So watch my community tab for the next survey to see what book we'll be reading through next. Or I might not come back until Black August. It just depends on how my schedule works. I got called in for jury duty, so I'm going to do that. I'm supposed to go on a family vacation, and I have a couple of things I need to take care of this summer. So it just depends on what happens. So I will let you know, but watch my community tab to look for what book we read next and what we're going to be doing this summer. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon. Peace, guys.